The weather outside is frightful, but the trains are so delightful. So brave the snow in this barren land as I grow Chugtopia as big as I can. I'll need some money if I want to build anything substantial, so to get started, I'll build a passenger line. I will never not do this as my very first action in every map that I will ever play, so I think I can just skip over this. Instead, let's do some theory crafting. What does a city need to grow its population? As you might have noticed, I'm playing a landscape other than temperate for once. This means that growing a city is a little harder than normal. In temperate climates, cities will grow on their own, naturally, with the only requirement being empty space. In tropical or Arctic climates, cities require a specific cargo to be delivered for growth to be permitted at all. Arctic cities require food, and tropical cities require both food and water. These deliveries are required at least once per month, but they don't care about the quantity. Since the city requires food, I'll try and scale it as the population grows. It's really not necessary, but I would like to utilize at least a handful of industries for a dedicated food network. I'd also like to try and transport as many of the city's passengers as possible. Cities will produce passengers every month, the amount of which is based on their total population. Transporting these passengers has no effect on growth or really anything, but it does seem like a fun challenge that will grow in difficulty over time. The passenger line is done, now I can start building. I apologize in advance that these snow tiles are essentially light mode for Transport Tycoon. Consider yourself lucky that this video is only a minute fraction of the amount of time that I had to spend in the tundra. It's time to design the center of the city. This will definitely change over time, but that's just part of the process. I'd like for this city to eventually cover most of the map, so I'll need some kind of pattern that I can repeat ad infinitum. I am familiar with optimal road layouts for city growth, but those layouts don't take into account having to transport passengers. In addition, I'll need a large empty area for a station to receive food. The design I ended up with maximizes empty tiles while still maintaining a road grid. The grids are slightly larger than they need to be, so I can fit a passenger station later. As you can see, there's a ton of industries that are blocking my roads. Here's a fun piece of information. If you place a station next to an industry and never serve it with vehicles, that station's low rating will slowly bring that industry towards bankruptcy. I'm not gonna lie, this mechanic is kind of cheesy, but I want these things to go away sometime within this decade. There are quite a few industries here, and even more in the surrounding area. Removing them is a process I'll have to continue as the city expands outwards. I have a few plans for this city layout. There are channels of roads extending in all 4 directions from the city center. These will soon serve as a highway for trains carrying passengers. The grids adjacent to these channels will each have a passenger station. Trains visiting these stations will then be collected and dispersed throughout the highways and the channels. I think I'll wait until we expand a bit more before I build any passenger rails though. I haven't yet mentioned how annoying it is to modify a city to this degree. Deleting houses and roads brings my rating down and blocks me from building within a radius of the city. Delivering cargo will bring that rating back up, but it's very slow. I have the option to bribe the city, which raises the rating a considerable amount, but it's very expensive at this point and has a high chance of failing and dropping the rating even further. Anyways, here's the station that will receive food for the city. It was quite challenging to fit all of this into the jungle of roads, but it does work. As you can see, I've utilized the roads extending from the city as a means to weave in a rail network. I've taken the liberty of building these rails to handle 2 lanes of traffic already. Usually, I'd start with 1 lane and upgrade later, but all of this land will eventually be swarmed by buildings, and I don't want to worry about upgrading around them. I won't be adding any more lanes here, but I did set aside a few blocks of land to expand the station later. I wasn't able to place many stations here, so it's good to have the option for more. The receiving station is finished, but I'll still have to deliver food if I want the city to grow. I'll go ahead and route these rails to the edge of the map and towards the area where I'll build a food plant. I funded one in the bottom of the map, so it could be as out of the way as possible. Arctic maps have a few chains of production that are different from temperate maps, and food is one of those production chains. It's similar to producing goods in temperate maps, except in this case, there's no need to input steel. This station took a while to figure out. As trains get longer, it becomes harder to measure out rails long enough to accommodate them. In the end, I'm really just playing train Tetris. Well, the station's all finished. Not gonna lie, I'm pretty proud of this one. This probably looks incomprehensible, so I'll try and explain what's going on here. Farm trains deliver their cargo to this station, and that cargo gets turned into food by the food plant. These stations will output that food into the trains that will deliver it to the city. Since the food trains will be waiting for any farm products to be delivered, I need a way to store any excess waiting trains. To handle these excess trains, I can employ an overflow that will reroute any backed up trains into a depot to be held in stasis. These trains will then be drip fed back into the network at the rate of about 1 per minute. Alright, this is all working. I think it's time to connect some farms. I generated this map to have as much snow as possible. Unfortunately for me, farms only generate on non-snow tiles, meaning I'm kind of screwed. Oh well, I only have to fill 2 lanes worth of traffic, so it's not that bad. As for connecting farms around the map, I'll try to keep the rails as close to the map border as possible. The trains serving these farms will have their own network, since there's no other input cargoes required. It might be due to the lack of suitable land, but these farms are generating very close together. This set of 3 farms is pretty juicy, and they're all conveniently located right next to the power plant. Yum! It's time for some train facts. If you're familiar with Transport Tycoon, you may know that different landscapes have their own train sets. Some trains are shared between landscapes, but most are not. All of my favorite trains from the temperate landscape are gone. The SH-40 and the Kirby Paul can't save me now. But lucky for me, the Centennial has my back. It may not be the fastest train in the shed, but it has good acceleration and can handle very sharp turns without slowing down. These rails need to be very compact to save space for the city, so anything that can reduce the land required is a welcome addition. I haven't complained about it yet, but money is a major issue at the moment. The initial passenger line is not keeping up with the amount that I've been spending, so getting these farm trains running not only feeds Chugtopia, but saves the company as a whole. In the end, there were only 3 areas on the map with farms, so this didn't take very long. That being said, the density of the farms that did spawn is pretty nice. Let's add some more trains! You know, it's been quite some time since I've made anything resembling a regular network. My past few maps have been pretty bonkers, and it would be a stretch to even call them networks. This map is quickly headed in that direction, but it's nice to get back to form, temporarily. Now that everything's been hooked up, the farm trains are getting pretty active. I think it's time to start delivering the produced food to the city. Turning this thing on is the point of no return. Houses will be sprouting up everywhere and will all serve as future roadblocks. Because of this, the city's favorability of me will be unmanageably low for quite some time. There will soon be thousands of buildings everywhere. Buildings that I'll have to swerve the network around and make space for. Any future construction will take a lot longer than what I'm used to now. Alright, here goes nothing. The food station is running very smoothly. The delivery station in the city also seems to be working pretty well, but I did make one mistake. The payout receipts are yellow. This means that there is no recipient for the cargo, it is only being held in the station without being delivered to the city. For the food to be accepted by the city, it needs to be delivered in close proximity to a high-density building. The receiving station is quite far from any building at the moment, so the cargo will need a little help to get where it needs to go. A canal seems fit for the job. Yes, the good citizens of Chugtopia are fond of all modes of transport. Don't mind the freezing temperatures, as we employ only the finest icebreakers to do our shipping. Alright, this won't be a permanent solution. As the city grows, the train station will quickly be surrounded by high-density buildings, and the canals will no longer be needed. Plus, this looks just a little too absurd. I think I'll save the canals for the ships-only playthrough. Time for Chugtopia to spread its wings and grow to its heart's content. I'll just set it to fast forward for some time and we'll see how it goes. Well, this is pretty slow, but I have one idea that may speed up growth. I always mention that I use the City Mania client to make building easier, but that isn't all that this client has to offer. The name City Mania describes its actual purposes pretty well. Besides copy and pasting, this client also gives you a massive amount of information about cities, and in particular, growing them. The feature I'll be using today is the Fund Regularly button. Funding a city just about doubles its growth speed, but the effect doesn't last very long. With this option enabled, the client automatically funds new buildings, so the effect doesn't wear out. Alright, let's try that again with gusto. This is looking a lot faster. The population seems to be exponentially growing. If you look at the population, the first 15,000 takes 3 times as long as the second. I'm sure this effect won't last forever, but it is nice to see Chugtopia growing so quickly. Food production is settled, and we've got a growing population. I think it's about time I start scaling up the city. While I do this, I'll also start adding in some transportation for our humble citizens. I left an empty row of tiles inside of each block for a train station to slot into. The capturing range of these stations is more than large enough to fully cover the block it resides in. This is definitely way overbuilt, but to be fair, I haven't played a map anything like this before, so I'm doing all of this for the first time. I've boiled the entire city down to this one repeatable unit. The city's design has changed quite a bit since the start, but I'm not really sure if it's for the better. As you can see, there's a lot more space being taken up by rails now. This unit manages to fit 2 lanes of traffic and about 20 stations. Originally, I wasn't anticipating needing so much throughput, but here we are. Well, I designed this unit in such a way that I could tile it across the entire map. So let's get building! When I said across the map, I really meant across the entire map. Or at least, across the entire map where there is space available. This took an insanely long time to build. Building city grids is not a complex task, but it is a tedious one. The City Mania client can copy and paste, but it only works on rails, and most of what I'm building here are roads. I'd also like to point out that all of this was somehow built with a budget of only 15 million. When the income passes a certain threshold, money sort of becomes pointless. Well, that sucked, but I'm not done yet. I need to reroute the network with all of our farm trains to be closer to the edge of the map. I thought I made it close enough earlier, but I was a fair bit off and the city needs as much space as it can get. One more issue. I forgot to plan a location for delivering the passengers collected throughout the city, and now that the map is filled, I have very few options. I'm assuming that I'll need around 5 lanes to handle all of these trains. The problem is that there's very little room left. There are very few locations on the map that accept delivered passengers, which further narrows my options. But lucky for me, there's a lesser known feature that's going to save me here. When you found a company, you are able to place your company's headquarters anywhere on the map. This building normally doesn't do much. Its main purpose is to reflect your company's performance rating. But it just so happens that this building accepts passengers as delivered cargo. So I guess I'm giving the good citizens of Chugtopia a tour of my madness. The only place on the map with enough space for this monster train line is the bottom corner next to the food plant. It'll be a tight fit, but I think I can make it work. When I'm building stations, I usually aim to have 6 platforms for each lane of traffic. Well, I'm building 5 lanes, so that's 30 station platforms I'll have to make room for. I've been pretty extreme with my usage of terraforming so far, and it's fair to say that that's going to continue. I also make use of a lot of station spreading. If you hold control while building a station, a window pops up giving you the option to merge it with another station. Usually, the range for merging 2 stations together is very small. I had to crank the dial to 11 to get all of these stations to merge together. This is another mechanic that I would consider a bit cheesy, but there's really no other way to make a station this big, and to be fair, it makes the end result look a lot cooler. I know that my builds usually end up looking pretty cursed, but I'm not even sure what I'm looking at here. This whole corner is incomprehensible. Now, I just have to link this station to the rails in the city. There are 3 rail channels that serve as the inputs and outputs for trains. For trains to access these channels, each will need its own junction. Normally, a 5-lane junction would be pretty agonizing to build, but these will not have to be full junctions. Since I only want these trains to visit the city and the headquarters, tracks that send outgoing trains back into the city are not needed. That's not to say that these aren't a challenge though. Trains exiting the city need to be balanced between all 5 lanes on the main line. This function alone takes up most of the space in the final construction. I am very happy with how these turned out. When working with this amount of lanes, satisfying patterns start to emerge. With everything now finished, I can finally explain how this whole thing is gonna work. Since I've placed far too many stations to manually set up transport lines, I'm going to let the trains think for themselves. Instead of setting up orders myself, I'll use the Pathfinder algorithm to do the work for me. First of all, we need an order to anchor the trains. These trains won't be given orders to visit any specific station within the city, but they will need one order that they can always fulfill. In this case, that order will be to deliver passengers to the headquarters. After a train completes this order, they are then sent out of the station and into the web of rails making up the city grid. Since this is the only order these trains have, they will stop at nothing to fulfill it on loop. The issue for these trains is that after leaving the station, they have to find a way back to the headquarters. This is the part where our trains gain self-awareness. The only way for trains to turn around is to visit one of the passenger stations in the city. In the process of visiting these stations, the trains also pick up any passengers they are able to carry. The exit of these stations output trains into the rails heading out of the city and back to the headquarters. After the train makes its way back to the headquarters, the cycle can repeat again. I am simplifying this quite a bit, but it's really not as complicated as it might seem. This is actually a really good way to add mass amounts of trains without doing very much thinking. These trains all share the same set of orders, so you just slap down a couple dozen of them and let it rip. Now it should go without saying that building an entire city's worth of rails and a 5-lane mega rail network completely from scratch and without testing it is going to produce a few bugs. A few, in this case, is a massive understatement. I spent quite a while placing down a bunch of signals I missed and fixing up some missing connections. Alright, now to the next problem. The passenger network is built to handle 5 lanes worth of traffic. I currently am running 0 trains on this network. I would like to have a couple hundred trains, but they cost $500,000 each. With my current balance, I struggle to buy even 10 trains, let alone hundreds. I can solve this by making sure the few trains I can buy are guaranteed to get a good load of passengers. If I selectively block trains from visiting low-density areas, the trains will be forced closer to the core of the city where the stations are more busy. The hope is that these trains pay out enough to add even more of them to the network. Alright, time for the moment of truth. I'll buy 10 trains and see how they fare. There's not much traffic yet, but it is nice to finally see some activity on the network, and the trains seem to be having no trouble navigating this wild maze of rails. Let's go back to the headquarters and see what kind of money we're making. Hey, that's not too bad. It's not a huge amount by any means, but this is definitely enough fuel for the train fire. I'll buy another set of trains and let this thing run for a little while. In the meantime, let's watch Chugtopia grow. The population is nearing 200,000. Watch it double before our very eyes. It's kinda hard to tell just how fast it's growing without looking at the population. Since any new building adds to the ever-growing radius of the city, expansion will visually slow over time. I have to say, this is a pretty cool sight. The gradient between low and high density buildings is pretty satisfying. As we make it to the center of the city, there's nothing but skyscrapers covering the entire screen. Though the city is very large now, there's still a lot of space to fill. The population is sitting at over 400,000 citizens, but I'd like to take it all the way to 1 million if possible. Let's add some more trains! That time-lapse did more than just introduce 200,000 new citizens, it also fueled the purchase of 100 new trains. This should be a good stress test for the network. Surprisingly enough, it handles the influx of traffic pretty well. Since there's so many trains now, I went ahead and opened up every path that I blocked off earlier. Now, our trains can go anywhere they'd like. That isn't to say that this network is completely without problems though. If we take a look at the vehicle map, you can see that our trains appear to be gravitating towards certain areas in the city. This can mostly be attributed to the ginormous amount of stations I've placed everywhere. One flaw in this self-regulating train system is that trains try their hardest to get back to the headquarters as quickly as possible. If a train is waiting at a station, other trains can see that that station is full. The goal is to use this mechanic to disperse trains deeper into the city, but the overabundance of stations gives too many trains the option to use them immediately upon entering the city. I think it's for the best that I remove a good few of them. Honestly, I'm not too sure what I was thinking when I added so many, especially when I could achieve the same amount of coverage using only half the stations. They're a little more spread out now, but I'm still not satisfied. Maybe adding some more trains will help. That looks a lot better than before. It's definitely not the most perfect system, but these self-regulating trains are running pretty well. There's over 200 now, with room to grow. Since most of the city's infrastructure is in place, I should probably go and clear up all of that land that I claimed. I've personally grown kind of attached to the tiny red signs everywhere. With the right transparency settings, these colors make up a nice palette. That being said, these signs are preventing a lot of possible buildings from being placed, so sadly they all must go. I didn't realize just how much land I had claimed. At some point, my mind just sort of blocked it out. I definitely will miss having a darker shade of tile under the rails. It provided a much needed contrast in this bright frozen wasteland. Immediately, new buildings start popping up everywhere. This is enough growth to push the population of Chugtopia to 750,000. That reminds me, I have a food plant I've been ignoring for over 50 years. I probably should check up on that. Well, to say I've been ignoring it is a bit of a stretch. I have been adding trains pretty often to keep up with the ever-growing production of these farm industries. Boy am I glad I built the entire food network with 2 lanes, because upgrading it with all of this other nonsense going on would have been a massive pain. I think I'll go ahead and finish the second set of platforms for the food stations. Afterwards, I can give any leftover space back to the city. The land here is pretty valuable. Tiles closer to the city generate buildings with a larger amount of residents. It is nice to finally get this out of the way. All of that claimed land was the last remnant of the city's construction. I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to at least try to transport a decent amount of the city's passengers. Well, I can definitely say that I'm trying. Or maybe, crying. As it stands, I'm transporting around 12,000 passengers per month. This may seem like a lot, but that's only about 10% of what Chugtopia is generating. And it's not for a lack of trying either. I vastly underestimated the throughput required to transport this many people. As an example, let's look at the station with the most waiting passengers. With a constant stream of trains, this station still manages to outgrow the network. These trains carry over 300 passengers, and it's still not enough. To be fair though, there is a skyscraper in every single tile within its range. If I ever try this challenge again, I'll definitely be scaling up this infrastructure. Maybe 10 lanes would be enough, but probably not. I think it's time to add some more trains. The passenger network handles 200 of them pretty well, so let's add even more. It's a little surprising just how few trains can fill up an entire network. I guess the trains are taking fairly short routes, which results in an overall lower amount of total rail space. With these new trains brings new traffic jams in the city. I've mostly been fixing these off camera, but I should probably document the process at least once. I've mentioned before how cutting down on stations can help the dispersion of trains, but there's more to this. The self-regulation of these trains hinges on signal gaps and the amount of time it takes for a train to load in a station. These factors combined essentially reserve a route for an individual train. This reservation lasts until it is finished loading and is on its way back to drop off its passengers at the headquarters. When a train makes it to a station, it loads every waiting passenger until the station is empty or the train is at full capacity. Loading passengers from a full station takes a lot longer than loading from a mostly empty station. If I ensure that a station has a lot of waiting passengers, trains will spend more time loading and reserving the route. I can increase the number of waiting passengers by spreading the coverage of any smaller station. This will also have the effect of forcing trains to be more dispersed in the city. There we go, the jam has mostly cleared up. Chugtopia is nearing a population of 1 million. I really don't want to accidentally miss this, so I'll do one final time-lapse. This last bit of growth took longer than ever. I haven't talked much about the algorithm for city growth yet, but to put it short, the city follows roads randomly until it finds an empty tile for a new building. This means that intersections are not good for city growth, as it may cause the algorithm to loop around the same set of roads indefinitely. The optimal layout for city growth is a single stretch of road that spirals outwards from the city center. However, I find this to be a boring strategy, and it leaves little room for any shenanigans. And in the end, I hit 1 million either way. This is beyond absurd. Miles of city sprawl, only broken up by channels of self-aware trains. It's kind of a pointless statistic, but we hit this milestone almost exactly 100 years after starting the map. A century of Chugtopia. Here's to many more. This was my first real attempt at growing a city, and keeping up with all the madness that it brings. There are, of course, a lot of things I would do differently if I were to attempt this again. I stated before that 5 lanes simply isn't enough to handle this many passengers. And that is true, but I'm suspecting that the self-regulating trains may be an issue as well. Since I have very little control over which stations they visit, a lot of these trains barely pick up any passengers. These low-passenger trains are essentially doing nothing, acting only as moving roadblocks for other trains. A 5-lane megastructure is cool to look at, but a lot of this traffic is essentially useless. I'm also doubting that any vanilla train would be able to even deal with the amount of passengers generated by this city. As it stands, the city generates 150,000 passengers every month. Each of the 250 trains holds a maximum of 320 passengers, but their round trip is a lot longer than 1 month, and that's assuming that all 250 trains actually pick up a full load. A network capable of transporting this amount of passengers would likely need over 1,000 trains, and I'd have to drop the self-regulation in favor of a regular network. But to be honest, even with all of its flaws, I think that what I've made here is the cooler solution. I mean, these trains think for themselves, no Descartes. This might seem like an outro, but to be fair, it was supposed to be. But we have a lot of empty space left. I think it's time to cover the rest of this barren wasteland in roads. I won't be expanding the current passenger network any further, but I'll build a few local lines to make up for it. The road layouts I've chosen for this city are not exactly efficient in terms of city growth. Since the growth algorithm follows roads randomly, it's likely taking laps around the many blocks of Chugtopia. This means the farther outwards I expand, the harder it is for buildings to generate. But I can bypass these issues using tunnels. When the algorithm searches roads, it treats a tunnel as a singular road tile regardless of its length. If I strategically place these tunnels to connect high and low density areas, it should speed up growth. The only issue is that this terrain is far too mountainous to place any tunnels, so this won't be as optimal as it would be otherwise. Well, that took a while, but the map is finally filled. It might be hard to see from this distance, so here's a better view. There are still a handful of empty areas, but they are blocked off by other infrastructure, and at this point, I would say that this is good enough. There's not much left to do besides turn this thing on and let it grow. At this point, city growth has slowed to a visual halt. Population is rising steadily, but the city is so large now that any new buildings hardly add to its radius. Unfortunately, Chugtopia may never span across the entire map. That being said, we pass 1.5 million pretty easily. This is now the largest city that I've ever personally seen, although I have heard of some cities hitting upwards of 3 million. If I had gone with the optimal road layout, forewent transporting any passengers, and starved my citizens, I could have beat that. But then what would be left of Chugtopia? The west corner has had a really hard time developing, but I have one final trick up my sleeve that may speed up growth. The growth algorithm pathfinds through roads and takes a random direction when it meets an intersection. If I cut off all intersections on the way from the city center to the west corner, that algorithm will have no choice but to go there. I've been holding off on using this strategy because it causes other issues I'll have to fix later, but I want Chugtopia to span across the entire world. Alright, let's see if that had an effect. Almost immediately, a large number of houses start popping up. I guess my plan worked. This does come with the side effect of lowering the overall population. I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm assuming that cutting off the road connections for entire portions of the city has had some repercussions. So maybe I shouldn't have done that. The population is still declining, so I think I'll go ahead and put the connections back. Almost immediately, the city springs back to its previous state, except this time, more of the map is covered by buildings. In my book, that's an even trade. I think I have to accept that growing a city this large is just too difficult, or maybe just too boring to continue further. But 1.5 million citizens is nothing to scoff at. And even if our rail lines struggle to transport 10% of the population, I think they at least look cool. The city itself has a lot of variance as it sprawls over this mountainous terrain. It's very uncommon that I end up with a map that is completely filled with no room for expansion, and this one is among the most absurd. It has now been over 200 years since I started this map, and I have to say I'm pretty sick of fast forwarding. If you liked this video, consider checking out my other content. I always try my best to take Transport Tycoon concepts to their logical limits, and my other videos are not unlike this one. Alright, that's enough from me. I'm outta here.